Studio, the Toledo Museum of Art. Today I'm going to make some Damascus steel. Damascus steel is really pattern welded steel. I'm going to use the forge, which is running right now, to weld the steel together to create a pattern. What I'm starting with is two alloys of steel. So to create contrast, I use two different types of steel. One is called 15N20. It's the same type of steel used to make bandsaw blades, or most bandsaw blades. So it has a high nickel content. So this will give me a shiny layer in the steel. The other steel I use is a straight high carbon steel called 1080. This is a very forgiving and easy to weld combination. Now this is a very small stack. Usually I do 2 to 10 times the size of that, but it would take too long just to heat up a chunk that size for the time we have. So I'm going to do a small billet. I often do small billets like this when I'm testing out a new alloy just to see how it reacts and its working properties. The first thing I need to do is to go over to the sander. I've already pre-cut my pieces, as you can see. But I need to clean the steel. When the steel comes from the factory, it has what we call mill scale, this black layer of iron oxide on there. So I'm going to grind it off. Okay, the other layers I've already cleaned. It's very important to have clean steel before you start. If you don't, dirt, oxide, other junk basically can get trapped between the layers. It causes what we call a delamination, just a bad spot. So now I need to temporarily tack weld the ends together, and I like to weld a handle on it so it's easier to hold. So I'm going to go over to the welding table on this side of the studio. Okay, so I have things set up over here. So when I first started making Damascus, gosh, it must have been about 1990, 1989. We're kind of just, teaching myself, learning what I could. We didn't bother cleaning the steel, but I have found over the years that I have a much higher success rate if I really grind this clean. You can also sandblast it, works quite well, and then also wipe it off. This particular steel, the bandsaw blade, 15N20, it's made into bandsaw blades. That's already clean. Because it has such a high nickel content, it's corrosion resistant, so there is no need to grind it off. So you can see I've alternated my layers. I have 3 layers of the 1080, 2 layers of the 15N20. So I have a 5-layer stack. Now, my method, because it's easy to remember, to forget which billet is which, since I often have many, I might have dozens of billets, is I have a little card. I write right on the card what material it is and how many layers I started with. I find it's much easier to keep track of what I'm doing that way. So this is my temporary handle. It's just mild steel, 3/4 inch. And this I need to clamp. So I'm going to get my welding clamp. And it's clean, so now I'm going to run what you'd call a bead or a weld on each end. So for that, I'm going to put my helmet on. Okay, and here we go. We're gonna weld. Yeah, I'll put a little bit more on this end. Okay, so now it's held together. I can take the clamp off. On this side, I left a blank spot. That spot is for me to weld the handle on. So I'm going to line that up and then go ahead and weld the handle on. Okay. So now I have a handle. The reason I have the handle is it's just easier to hold. Some people just weld a little stub, a little short stub, and they'll grab it with tongs. I find that is a little harder for me to hold, so I prefer this method. So now I can go to the forge. I'm going to heat it up, flux it, and weld it together. So right now, my forge is at a good temperature. I like it set at 2400 degrees Fahrenheit. Seems to work well for this combination of materials. Some steels I'll go a bit higher. Some steels maybe just a little lower. Some steels burn more easily. I'm going to get it red hot, brush it, to remove excess fire scale. If need be, I'll give it a tap or two at the hammer. Then I'll apply my flux. The flux is 4 parts borax to 1 part boric acid. I mix it up myself. You can buy it ready-made. There's many brands. I prefer to make my own because I know exactly what's in it. It's pure borax, pure boric acid, no impurities. Some people use borax that you can get at the grocery store. From the more than one person I've met has good results from it. You put it in your washing machine to get your clothes extra clean. That kind of borax. Now that can work, but that's not anhydrous borax. This is anhydrous borax. It's pure. The stuff from the grocery store has fragrance. It has some other impurities, which do burn off. But I find that flux doesn't stick or stay on the steel as long as I would like it to. So I stick with this. I've tried all different kinds. Like I was saying, I used to use pre-made, a brand called Crescent Weld, anti-forge, forge weld, had iron oxide in it, so it was red. It's good to experiment, but all in all, this seems to be the best. I even went to one extreme at one point just as an experiment. I think experimentation is fun, an important part of art making. Put the flux in the crucible and I boiled it to remove the moisture and impurities. Then I cooled it, but then it was like kind of like rock candy kind of chunks. And then I had to crush it. It made an excellent flux, but it was so labor intensive, it was not worth the effort. But it was a really fun experiment. You know, I read about it and someone said, oh, you gotta try it. It's the best flux in the world. And I tried it and I thought, well, you know, that was fun, but I'm not doing that again. Okay, so it's definitely red enough. I'm gonna brush that. You can see that excess fire scale comes off. Sometimes there's a little air gap in there. I might give it a little tap. And then I apply flux. Now honestly am a little heavy-handed with flux. Some people use, a lot of people would use less. But I'm going to show you a little thing I do, and that is I've coated the whole surface, including a little bit of the handle. Then I shake or scrape the excess off. So it's actually not as much as it may look like. The excess I can crush and reuse. So now I go back in the forge, and now this is my eye. I have a narrow window in which that steel is actually welding to itself. So the best way to describe it is when I look in the forge, I'll see the flux boiling, literally like it's boiling. And then as I rotate it, when I see the bubbles sheet down the side, kind of like rain on a freshly waxed car, you got a sheeting action, that's my indicator that it's time to weld. Then I'll take it to the power hammer and hammer it together. So it's definitely boiling, and it's a small billet, so it just came up to temp. It's sheeting. So I'm going to turn my hammer on. And away we go. First weld done. I usually weld at least twice before I stretch the material out. I'll explain that as I go. So brush it clean. It's still obviously very hot. Now that very well might be enough, might be a good weld. But just to make sure it doesn't hurt, I find to go ahead and do it twice to make sure that I have a very solid bond. So all welding, by the way, was done this way with flux in a forge, except maybe they would be using coal or charcoal or coke. Was done in a forge until they invented electrical welding. Things like fences, gates, any decorative welding, tools, chisels, saws, anything that was handmade and involved the weld was done this way. Now, because I do a lot of work with the power hammer, I have to wear hearing protection so I don't go deaf. So I'm going to put these on. And I've just come up to temp. I see a nice sheeting action. We'll go for weld number 2. Okay, so now I'm going to do something on the table here. So now I have 5 layers. It's bonded. It's a solid piece of steel. It's one solid piece of steel. Now, while it's still hot, I'm going to mark this, and what I like is a hot mark crayon. They use these in steel factories and so on. So I'll use a ruler. It looks like I got about 7 inches, so half of that would be 3.5. So while it's still hot, I use the marker, let the marker burn off, and it leaves a white mark. There's nothing I know of that will stay on red hot steel without burning off. So my mark is a little off. I'm double checking, so I need to go a little bit to the left of my mark. I'm going to take my hot cut chisel, put a little mark, hit it with the hammer, because that hot mark crayon is going to burn off in the fire, and double check. That looks pretty good. That looks centered to me. What I'm trying to do is mark dead center. Now I'm going to make that mark a little bit deeper. Okay. So where the mark is, I'm literally going to hot cut it now. So I'm going to reheat it, bring it to the power hammer, and use my hot cut under the power hammer. So a little tidbit of history for you. Damascus is really, you're talking about the pattern more than the technique. Technically, I'm making pattern welded steel. Damascus is also used to describe Wootz steel. The original Damascus steel is really Wootz, W-O-O-T-Z. That was invented in India in mid-first millennial BC. Now, the first written documents of Wootz steel swords were from the first, from Alexander the Great's campaign in India. Talked about the fierce warriors with their Damascus blades and how their blades were incredibly strong and they wouldn't break. Those were Damascus blades. So how did it get the name Damascus? Well, the Wootz steel made in India, that actually was a type of crucible steel. In other words, the steel was made in a little crucible, and the pattern resulted from the mixture of elements that were in the crucible, not by actually layering the steel as I am now. Anyway, it's a nickname that stuck, and everybody calls it Damascus, so I'm going to call it Damascus. So now it's hot enough where I can hot cut it. So the name Damascus came from Syria, Damascus, where some of the best Damascus swords made from Wootz steel were made. Okay, so I'm using what's called the hinge method. I've cut 2/3 of the way through the steel when it's red hot, because it'll just clog the grinding wheel. So I just let that cool for a moment. There's actually, I was talking about Wootz steel and crucible steel. I'm getting my angle grinder, and well, actually I'll go around this side. I didn't want the cord to get on the hot steel. There's many people now who, because they're interested in it, they're making their own steel. They're making their own crucible steel. They're making their own wood steel. And most of them are making knives out of it, but some people are making other things. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of information online. It's really fascinating, but very, very labor-intensive process. Okay, so now that it's not red hot, I'm going to grind the dirt, the excess fire scale. Not really dirt, but that's how I think of it. It's dirty. It's iron oxide. I'm going to grind that off to clean metal. You know, that was a bit awkward. Maybe it is better if I stand on this side. Okay. So I've ground it clean. Now you may see a little color on there. That blue color is, that just is a heat color that forms around actually that's just a little heat discoloration, nothing to worry about. The main thing is all this black stuff is gone, it's removed. I don't want to see any of that. So if that's in there, that could prevent a good weld from forming. So now I'm going to heat it up. Handle's starting to get a little hot. I might have to quench the handle pretty soon, but first I'm going to fold it over. So I'm going to get it hot and then bend it over the edge of the anvil. Maybe I'll brush it a little first. Then I'll apply flux and then I'll weld again. The first Damascus I made with coke fuel. Coke is partially burned coal. Burns very hot, very clean. It's a little hard to start, but boy, it works well. But the problem is, if you don't watch your steel, you can burn it in a split second, which I did more than once. If you have 30 hours in a piece of steel, it's awfully disappointing when you burn it. But that's just the nature of it. Like in many media, these things happen. The good thing about gas, you can burn the steel, but you have a little more control. You have more time to react, I would say. So I brushed the area that's going to touch itself. Now I'm bending it back over itself. Now the Japanese swordsmiths and bladesmiths who make layered steel in their swords, for instance, they use a very similar technique. They cut, they fold, but they don't use this kind of flux. They use a burned rice straw and a clay slurry is a traditional flux they use. And they have a very specific way of welding. They'd weld it, say, lengthwise 13 times and then horizontally 13 times. Every school does it a little bit differently. But once that's established, they do that. And they do it the same way. I think often generations of smiths of the same family will have been making swords. So some of the very good, famous swordsmiths, you know, Japanese swords. I mean, I don't study them, but I do find them fascinating. I find the way they make them quite interesting. So my flux is starting to boil. Good. I always put the layers edge up so the flux can soak in between the layers. Now wait for some sheeting action. It can be deceiving sometimes because you get sheeting action for a brief moment, then the bubbles get larger and larger, you're not going to get sheeting action, and if you're not careful and keep going, you actually do burn the steel. So I just started to sheet. I'm going to turn my hammer on. Okay, I now have 10 layers of steel. Again, I'm going to repeat that weld, the welding process. Actually, years ago, if you look on the Museum of Art's YouTube videos, I did a video called How to Make a Japanese Wakazashi. I used modern techniques, but I made a traditional type of sword, but I use modern tools because we don't have the traditional type of forges and tools used by the Japanese smith. But I constructed the sword the same way that a traditional smith would. So if you're interested in all, that's worth checking out. I think I left my dark glasses over here. So a Wakazashi is the medium length sword. The long one is the katana. The Wakazashi is tushaku, or about 2 feet long. Okay, good, it's boiling. Now if this was a big, like say a 25, 50 pound billet, I might be sitting here just waiting for it to heat up for 15 minutes. So that, I mean, I think it was a good, I'm glad I didn't do that. You know, it gets boring watching it heat up. It's already ready to weld. Excellent. Go lengthwise and just flattening. So I'm going to mark it again and mention a few more things. So the first weld I did, I started at the end. The second weld, I start at the back. I just like to alternate to make sure any flux in between the layers is squished out, for lack of a better term. I have it squished out. You don't want that flux trapped in there. So I do work from different sides. I purpose consciously say, okay, let's start on the end. And then the next weld, let's say, okay, let's start on the heel or the handle side. So I left my hot cut here. I like to put a light mark and then double check, because there's nothing worse for me than cutting it in the wrong spot after you put all that time and energy into making Damascus. That looks pretty good, actually. So if it's off, if it's just a light mark, I can redo the mark. And I'll make a little deeper mark. Okay, so I'm just, I'll do one more fold and weld. And basically, to build up the number of layers I want, I would just continue this process over and over. So I started with 10 layers. I have, 5 layers. I now have 10. I cut it and fold it, I'll have 20. Now it'll go faster. And then from 20, 40 to 80, 160, 320, and so on. How many layers do I use? So it depends on what I'm making. I make jewelry, belt buckles, I've made vessels, and I do make a few knives from the Damascus. It depends on how I want the pattern to look. I might do as few as 24 layers for a very broad, dramatic pattern, to as many as 500 layers for a very fine, tight pattern. Once you start getting into the 500 and beyond, the layers are so fine you can hardly see them. At least that's my opinion. So I'm going to the power hammer now. So what I'm putting in is a sacrificial plate. So if I accidentally cut through the steel, I don't cut into my nice die. I have to cool off the tool so it doesn't lose its hardness. That plate gets hot, so I'll grab it with tongs, and it's safer to grab with tongs. And often I give it a little tap just to help straighten it out. What I have made so far, the smith would call a random pattern. I'll show you an example of a random pattern at 64 layers. Oh, I gotta go under to grab this. All right, that was a little awkward, but it will work. Easier for me if I stand on this side. Okay, so here we go, grinding that clean. Okay, got it cleaned off. I'm gonna go back in the fire. So this is not the only way to make Damascus, but it's probably the most popular way to make it. Probably most smiths use this approach. If you don't have a power hammer, What I did starting out is just use a hand hammer. I would just spend hours and hours hammering. But I had a young back then and I could take it. Nothing wrong with that. Just takes, a lot of elbow grease. A power hammer just makes it faster. So what's become quite popular, first time I saw it was in the early 90s. A lot of people are using hydraulic presses. Instead of a power hammer, they are not as loud. They take up a smaller footprint in a shop. So they use the press the same way, but they squish the steel together, basically. They compress it. By the way, the first few blows, whether you're using a power hammer or a press, you do very gently. I'm not flooring the pedal on the power hammer, for example. If I were to hit it too hard, the layers would slide. They would actually not stick. So I do it lightly at first, and then once I think it's gotten a good weld, then I can hit real hard. One advantage of the hydraulic press is you can put many different shaped dies in. So you can create more complicated patterns, a little more variety possible in that respect. You can put V-blocks in, for instance, and combine 4 bars together. That would be kind of difficult on a power hammer. Doable, but much more difficult. So, as you can tell, there's a lot of heat involved. I wear a leather jacket, welding jacket, because I've got burns all over myself from making Damascus, because I find it kind of addictive. I really love the process, and I love making things out of Damascus. I have lots of t-shirts when I started out that literally look like Swiss cheese, just full of holes, until it dawned on me that I probably should wear some protective clothing. And so now automatically, if I'm going to make some, I put the leather jacket on. I'd rather be hot than get burned. Good. Is that a welding temp? Within I'm just guessing here, say 15 to 30 seconds. Depends how large your billet is. The smaller it is, of course, the faster it cools off. But what I'm getting at is, you have to work quickly. So I have to get from the forge to the hammer quickly, do my hammering, and then after a few moments, I know it's cooled off beyond the point of welding. Damascus is good to make in winter. It's a little harder to do in summer. I don't know many people have an air-conditioned shop for making Damascus, but I've done it. It's already at welding temp. It heated up super fast. shut that off. Gonna let it cool for a second. Now, so I started with 5 layers. I welded it, cut it, then it was 10. I welded it and cut it, so now I'm at 20 layers. So I'll make a note on my card, I now have 20 layers. That's enough for a simple pattern. I'm sure I'm not sure. I may take that farther. You know, it wouldn't be hard to make that 40 or 80 layers. But I think you get the idea. I don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over and over. But I do want to show you some samples over here on the table. I'm going to take this width, and you can compare. Now, as you look at this is cold. This is a random pattern, which I'm going to talk about. I left a sample over there. So it kind of looks like wood grain. A random pattern, like it sounds, is random. So the effect that you get, the layers, it's how the steel was hammered and how much burned off, how much ground off, that creates the pattern. The layers are going this way. This one is 64 layers. Now, I'm going to actually do this in kind of 2 parts. So the next video, I'm going to show some variations, excuse me, some variations you can do to make different patterns. So what I just made is going to look like this. The pattern would just be a little broader, being fewer layers. Now, the size of billets I often do are more like this, to give you an idea of scale. But you can imagine this would take quite a while to heat up. Or something like this is quite common for me to make. So that one happens to be 152 layers, same material. That one also happens to be random, my little note. So I forge it down to a little bit thicker than the thickness I need for whatever I'm making. So this is rough stock for various projects. This one, these 2 are billets in progress. So I've made the number of layers I want. This one's 256, this one's 160. And then these I will actually use to create different patterns for you. So I will do that on Friday's video. So we'll do one twisted pattern, and I'll talk about a couple other ways to create a pattern. So just kind of a sneak peek or a little hint, I should say. I'm going to talk about twisting, about stock removal method, and the bumping and grinding method. So stock removal, I actually grind the pattern in. The bumping method, I hammer patterns in the steel, then I grind the steel smooth. Both ways create interesting patterns. I actually do like a simple random pattern. There's also, if you want to get very complicated, I have a mosaic in progress. It's not finished. But you can actually think of mosaics like tile mosaics. Very popular now. People are making just really wild patterns in mosaic steel. Every line is a different layer of steel. And they can spend just a tremendous amount of time making those patterns. So it's a real commitment of time. I experiment with a little, but I also like the real simple patterns like so I've showed you. So that's my video for today. Hope you like it. And I hope to see you on Friday for the next video on Damascus. I do occasionally teach Damascus in the studio here, so if you're interested, we might teach it in spring, you know, depending on how things go. So thank you very much, and happy forging. That was really fun. Thanks.